Well, thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for the time and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share the NetraMark story, which I'm always excited to do, as you know. I'm going to start at the beginning, assuming that there is very little understanding of NetraMark and go from there. So, as a company, to put this together in a very, very simple way, NetraMark is an AI company that is pointed at the pharmaceutical industry. And what we do is we focus on a very, very specific problem. Clinical trials fail at an egregiously high rate. And with the invent of and the advancements in artificial intelligence, what we've been focused on is building a capability to specifically help pharmaceutical companies identify subpopulations that could be impacting drug response, placebo response, and or adverse events. These are all key things, these three things, that ultimately could cause a clinical trial to fail. Um, excuse me. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I do want to also highlight that everything we're about to cover off is very much in alignment with FDA guidelines from the perspective of what you can or can do when it comes to clinical trials, as long as you do them what's called pre-randomization. And I'll get into all of that, but I did want to just add the footnote that we are in alignment with what the regulator supports from the perspective of clinical trial enrichment, we call it. So specifically, if we want to start at the beginning, I talked about these egregiously high failure rates. So if you look at this from the perspective of molecule invention and identification through to commercialization, if you can believe it, 88% of candidate medicines don't actually make it through to commercialization. And if you look at the later phases, so when you have a molecule or a drug that you identify, you go through several steps. You go through preclinical a step in a clinical trial, then phase one, phase two, phase three, and then into commercialization. And as you can imagine, this is very expensive. All the way to commercialization can be billions of dollars. But as you expand through these phases, especially when you get to the later phases of a clinical trial, this becomes very critical because you've invested a lot of money to get your drug this far along in the clinical trial process. And what I wanted to share with you were some further pieces of information around late phase failure rates. And I highlight these because NetraMark very much focuses in on late failure studies. So if you look at this and say to yourself, okay, imagine yourself running a pharmaceutical company and you get to phase two, you have a successful phase two, meaning you met your endpoint, and now you're going to go into phase three. In two particular therapeutic areas, I wanted to point out what the approval rates look like. And in those two areas are what we call CNS, which are central nervous system related diseases, things like depression, etc., and oncology. Those are two areas that we focus on because they're massive markets. So imagine you have a depression drug in CNS that successfully gets through phase two. Did you know that you only have about a 49% chance? You have a 51% chance of getting approval in phase three. So you have a 49% failure rate. You get all this way, spending all this money, and you're still pretty much 50-50 that you're going to pass phase three. And it's actually worse in oncology, 35% approval rate, which means 65% of the drug candidates that make it through phase two successfully in oncology, 65% fail in phase three. This is the problem and the area that we focus on addressing with NetraMark. Can we somehow work with pharmaceutical companies to ingest data from their live clinical trials? These aren't third-party data sets that we're talking about here. This is a very unique aspect of what we're doing. We're talking about data from the pharmaceutical company's trial, which is specifically data associated to the drug that they administered to the patients in the trial, and there's an assortment of data that's captured. We analyze that data so that they can have a higher probability of success in a late phase study, i.e. phase three. Wouldn't that be a wonderful solution? Well, we want to also pair that with this is a massive market. There are billions and billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of trials that have been ongoing, if you will, from back in 2010, almost 400,000. And if you look at global clinical trial support services, we're talking about a market that was about 25 billion in support services, clinical trial support services. It's expanding to 47 billion. So it's a massive market, a very clear problem, and AI in healthcare is accelerating at a very quick rate with a 48% compound annual growth rate. So this is a high growth area where there's a massive amount of opportunity. And what I'll show you here is very little competition. So when you think of clinical trials, there's all sorts of news that you might hear about AI and the pharmaceutical industry. And what I want to be clear about is what we do and what we don't do and why that is. So the first part you got to understand is a lot of buzz is in around what we would call drug development, pointing AI at these massive data sets to help you find these insights, to help you come up with the new drug, the new AI discovered drug that's going to be able to solve all sorts of diseases that are out there. We don't do that. I'm very hopeful for those companies. There's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars being invested into this area. We do not do that. It's a very competitive landscape. The other place that AI is being pointed at is what we call clinical trial operations. So you now have an approved protocol. The regulator has said, yes, you can go ahead with your trial. And now you go into the clinical trial process and you start recruiting people and administering drugs and doing all the things that you do in a clinical trial. There are a lot of companies that are focused in clinical trial operations. So they do things like ingest these large electronic medical record databases to help find people to put into the trial faster. Okay, that makes sense. We don't do that, a lot of competition. Now, these two areas, though, of drug discovery and clinical trial operations actually make sense to initially point AI there. And the reason is the data sets are massive. Okay, so that all makes sense, but we don't do that. And why don't we do that? Well, as I said, it's a highly competitive area, et cetera, and very, very capital intensive. What Dr. Geraci did, who is the founder of the Netra AI technology, he's a PhD mathematician with several postdoc degrees. What he focused on was to say, you know, where the problem really lies here is within the subpopulations that are in the trial. So imagine you have, and you're in phase 3 and you have 200 people in your trial. Could it be that there are 30, 40, 50, 60 people that are actually driving the issue within the trial? How could you find those issues and what they are so that you could design a trial in an appropriate way from what we call an enrichment perspective so that you're actually recruiting drug responders and placebo non-responders? So he started to think about this problem. Now, why aren't there a lot of AI companies thinking about this problem and attacking this problem? Because the data sets are small. This is counterintuitive to AI. Most people would scratch their heads and think, well, that's not where I'm going to focus my AI technology. How can I use AI to find statistically significant subpopulations that are affecting drug response or placebo response or adverse events? And being the wizard PhD mathematician that Dr. Geraci is, he spent almost 7 years of his life building the underlying mathematics to actually ingest that data and figure out what the statistically relevant subpopulations are that could be extracted. Now, why do you want to extract those subpopulations? You want to extract those subpopulations because those actually drive the design of your protocol. So the protocol, think of it as the architectural document. When you're building a house, you get an architectural document that guides all the trades with respect to how to build a house. Well, it's very similar to a protocol. A protocol is a definition type document that defines the drug, and it also defines, there's a section in there called the study population, and it's got the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Who should I include in the study, and what are the properties associated with that? And who should I exclude? So what we do is we analyze the data that comes out the back end of each of these phases, and then we go back to the pharmaceutical company and we say, you should enrich, is the word that they use in the pharmaceutical industry, which means make some changes to the inclusion-exclusion criteria with the variables that we discovered. That's what we fundamentally do. So that then when you go into the trial and you start recruiting faster using all that other AI stuff, you're recruiting the right people to increase the odds of a successful trial. Again, this is all pre-randomization, our work. It's all in line with what the regulator likes to see. And we like this area because there are very few other companies doing this. I want to also highlight, this isn't a fantasy and a dream, et cetera, of what we're building. The tech stack is built and in commercialization. So we're in a commercialization phase of our business now. Okay, so the question then becomes, well, George, given all the advents of large language models, given all the smart people in the pharmaceutical industry, can't they take a look at that data themselves, their own clinical trial data, and potentially find the variables? And the answer to that is an overwhelming no. If you think about this, if you have 100 patients and 1,000 variables, so the average trial has, especially in CNS and oncology, is capturing between 500 and 20,000 variables per patient. So I'm just sitting here giving you an example of 1,000 variables captured per patient in a trial. If you wanted to find 6 variables that could be associated with drug response and placebo response or adverse events, the permutations and combinations of those variables to try and find the 6 variables that could be affecting those things is in the trillions. A human can't manually pick some variables and decide what to do. So the other thing that people come up with is, well, George, these pharmaceutical companies have, bioinformatics people and statistics people. Surely they analyze this data and can come up with this. What they typically do in what's called a post hoc subpopulation, which is the typical approach that they do, is if there's 1,000 variables, they'll pick 5, 10, 15 of those variables and try to analyze those. We look at all of those variables, 1,000 variables, 10,000, 20,000 variables. We look at all those variables simultaneously to find the variables that cluster together and form what we call a persona, a grouping of variables that's associated with the specific question that the drug company might have, which is, I'm worried about placebo response. Can you figure out what's driving placebo response? And the answer is, with our AI, yes, we can. This is what's so exciting about this technology. Very few competitors doing this. A very difficult problem to solve, which has taken Dr. Geraci many years, which creates a moat around our business with respect to, are there going to be 800,000 other players that will be entering this space? And the answer to that is no. And there's 2 moats, actually. The one moat is the mathematics and the technology, and the other moat is the pharmaceutical industry, a very difficult industry to penetrate. And in particular, it's difficult to penetrate because there's a regulator hovering over top. I won't get into all the details today. We have our own proprietary AI, which we call Attractor AI. That's the name of our AI. That's a trade secret. It's not patented because we want to keep the mathematics private. This is our proprietary AI, which we call Attractor AI, which is part of our NetraAI ecosystem, which is our technology that solves and addresses this problem. So I think hopefully what I've communicated so far is there's a very clear problem. Drugs fail at a very high rate. We're in a niche part where there's not a lot of competition. We have a solution that addresses this problem, and there's all sorts of publications and information on our website that supports what I'm telling you here in a very detailed fashion. And then the next leg that you're looking for when you're trying to understand, is this a company I want to invest in, is who are the people? And my background is more in the technology space, not in the pharmaceutical space, starting in IBM, many years there, et cetera. What's more important than me, actually, and part of my job as CEO, is how do I surround myself with a really amazing team that can help bring this to life? So I've talked about Dr. Geraci, excuse me. He's the PhD mathematician that brought this all together. A few of the other people I wanted to highlight is Josh Spiegel, who is fresh off an exit of Vericide, sold to WCG within the clinical trial space. So he's been in the pharmaceutical industry, if you will, in the operational parts of it for many years, and is off a $330 million exit. The other key point I want to highlight is Dr. Luca Pani. He's the former Director General of the Italian Medicines Agency, where I believe he oversaw about 800 drugs go into that market. He managed a multi-billion-dollar budget, and he currently still works on committees in the European Medicines Agency. An amazing person to have as your Chief Regulatory Officer. Our Chief Medical Officer is Dr. Larry Alves, former Executive Director at Pfizer. And our Chief Strategy Officer is Dr. Angelico Carda, who was the president and co-founder of Worldwide Clinical Trials, a very well-known CRO. And a CRO is a contract research organization. So remember when I said that a pharmaceutical company that invents the drug, there's a clinical operations part to the trial. That part is often outsourced to what's called a contract research organization that runs the trials. And Worldwide operates in over 65 countries around the world. And I'll talk a little bit more about them specifically as we move forward. I won't get into the details in this. This is very complicated. What I really want you to get out of this slide is this process takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So once the pharmaceutical company says, okay, we've had our data readout, you can now have access to our data. This is how long it takes. Now, the first question that often pops to mind for people is 4 to 6 weeks. This is an AI company. Why does it even take that long? The answer to that is that it's the data issue. So often the data comes in and it's not properly organized, et cetera. So there's a lot of what we call data wrangling that occurs, which is just the organizing of the data so that we can get it into the right structure to ingest it into our AI system. The actual this plumbing of the AI system is, 15, 20 hours of running our NetraAI ecosystem, if you will, to spit out what it is that are those variables and subpopulations that are affecting either drug response, placebo response, or adverse events. So that's the typical, study process and length of time, if you will. Okay. So now let's talk about the commercialization. I've given you hopefully a good idea of the technology. Now we want to talk about how are we commercializing this, which is often the next question I get. And we really have two paths to market. One is we go direct to the pharmaceutical companies, and the other is we go through channel partners. So I'm going to talk about these two factors. When we talk about this, the direct part of it, what I want to talk to you about is our ecosystem, our pipeline, if you will. So we've got well over 100 leads in our pipeline, and these are various pharmaceutical companies that are in various stages, and they often fall into three groupings. Large cap, so those are 100 billion or greater, and we have several of those conversations going on. They're very long and slow process where there's a little more action, if you will, as in the mid-size 1 to 20, 30 billion dollar. That's kind of the majority of our focus, and then there's single compound companies which are less than $1 billion. So there's lots of those deals that are in the works, if you will. And if we can close 10 to 15% of this before the end of the calendar year, we would be very excited about, bringing in another 10, 15, 20 contracts. So we're excited about that from that perspective. And then the other side is the channel partner route to market. If you, by any chance, have been following NetraMark, you will note that recently, you can see here on April 3rd, we announced a global agreement with Worldwide Clinical Trials that we're very proud of. As I had mentioned earlier, Angelico Carda was the co-founder and president of Worldwide Clinical Trials. So to give you some background on this organization, as I mentioned, they operate in about 65 countries in many therapeutic areas. Our agreement with them is a 3-year agreement. And really the idea here is to essentially be the AI arm of this aspect of what Worldwide brings to the sponsors and the pharmaceutical companies that they do business with. So the idea is that we will be embedded into their bids moving forward. And in that process, this will create what we call contract backlog. So in the actual press release, it says that we'll be included in all their phase 2 neuroscience and oncology clinical trials, and select phase 3 clinical trials, moving forward. To give you a scope of the size of the company, this is public information. You can look it up on, Google or whatever you use for search. But you'll see that they were bought about 1.5 years, 2 years ago by Kohlberg, which is a spin out from KKR, for a little over $2 billion, just to give you an idea. So this is an organization that wins a lot of bids every year. And now we're going to be in that ecosystem as one of the worldwide offerings, and it's actually going to be named, XYZ powered by NetraMark. Super excited about this. And what this is going to lead to is what we call projected contract backlog. So what is contract backlog? That is essentially whenever we sign a deal with a company, that's a contract, but we don't actually do the work until there's a data readout. So it goes into our backlog. So what we want to do as a company is build our backlog as much as humanly possible. Eventually, when those data readouts come, we start to run into the contract backlog, and that backlog turns into recognized revenue. So we believe that, over the next 12 months, we intend to sign a lot of contracts through our leads, which we have a lot in our pipeline and ecosystem, through our third-party relationships, like with the worldwide clinical trials. And our projected contract backlog is expected to be in the range of $8 to $10 million of contracted backlog over the next 12 months. And that will happen every 12-month sequence after that. So it will actually begin to build on each other in a very accelerated way. Hopefully that makes sense. So this to me is a key growth to drivers and long-term stability for NetraMark. Expanding our partner base, accelerating engagement cycles, moving off of proof of concept wins, etc. The other couple of things that I want to highlight is regulatory engagement. As I said, we are aligned with the regulatory guidance when it comes to the NetraMark technology, but what we really are trying to do is further our relationships and approvals from the regulator. We have applied to what's called a critical path innovation meeting. Hopefully within the next a few weeks, we will find out if we get approval for that. And what that really is approval to have a closed door meeting with the FDA where all parts of the regulator come together, they hear your story, and then give you guidance with respect to where to go within the regulatory organization. It could move us towards what's called an I-stand application or other paths. And this is what we ended up finding and thinking would be our best path forward. And of course, guided by Dr. Luca Pani, who's our Chief Regulatory Officer. So I'm just going to now summarize it, and then if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions. I believe there's a portion of this that we wanted to keep for questions from the audience. But to summarize, we've got a proprietary, advanced, commercial-ready platform. And this is very important in this AI space because you have to discern who's actually built a platform that's working and who hasn't. The other, from a market entry perspective, is we have established what we call product market fit. We have a beachhead client, which is a large NASDAQ-listed biopharmaceutical company with over a $10 billion market cap. We've engaged with contracts with them already that we're delivering, and we're working on expanding that relationship. We've also got traction from now, a worldwide clinical trial company, a CRO that operates in over 65 countries. So we have a sales pipeline and a contract backlog that is now evolving quickly. The other thing that I want to highlight is we're a unique AI company in that we also have a very low fixed cash burn. It's approximately 200,000 Canadian fixed cash burn per month. It's actually a little less than that, but you can look at our MD&A and you can see the adjusted EBITDA numbers in there, which would give you a really good idea of what that looks like. And we have a very high gross margin profile, which will be over 90%. So you can understand that as these contracted backlog numbers turn into revenue with a gross margin profile like that, and approximately a little over $2 million Canadian as far as what our bar is that we need to pass to start to then generate actual free cash flow. This is very exciting next 12 to 24 months for us. The last thing is the favorable revenue multiples in the AI space. And if you look, there's research on this that shows in the upper quartile, you're talking 60 times, some of this contract backlog and revenue. Median is 29x and the bottom is still 16x. And lastly, we have no debt on our balance sheets, just under a couple $1 million in cash. We also have a little over 8 million in warrants, of which 7.1 million of those warrants expire in September, October with 35 and 40 cent exercise prices, which is going to be another 2.5 million of cash. So we'll have lots of cash on the balance sheet with a very low fixed burn and a very fast evolving and building contract backlog. I will now turn it, I think, back over to Lindsay, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much for all of that information. You definitely have a lot in the bucket going on. There is a few questions that come in. The first one is, the pharmaceutical industry is heavily regulated. So how does NetraMark navigate compliance challenges while innovating an AI-driven trial design?
Yeah, great question. I tried to highlight it early on in the presentation, Lindsay. Maybe it wasn't totally clear. I want to make sure that I am very clear. So because the findings that we have are all applied to the trial pre-randomization. So when you recruit the people in, you recruit all the people in, and then you randomize. Some go in the placebo arm and some go in the drug arm. So we are already in compliance with what the FDA likes to see from the perspective of enrichment. And in the if you go to our website and you download our presentation, there's an entire FDA guideline document in there that shows what the guidelines are. And it's very clear in that document that we are in alignment. We're trying to further that just to basically get what we call an FDA endorsement, only to accelerate our our capacity to penetrate the pharmaceutical industry, but it's not required. So we are fully in alignment with the guidelines from the perspective of what the regulator would be looking for a technology such as ours.
Okay, well then let's flip over here. NetraMark's Attractor AI claims to revolutionize clinical trials. So the bigger question, I think, how does this technology tangibly reduce trial costs and timelines, and what evidence do you have that really supports that?
So if you look at the key factors of our technology, and again, there are very detailed publications that I would not have even remotely have as much time as possible. You can go to our website if you like, and under papers, I think you'll see white papers, publications, posters. There is an inordinate amount of information that validates how the technology works and the capacity for it to actually find the data. But there is a key thing, though, that I do want to highlight that addresses this question, which is a lot of AI is what we would call a black box, Lindsay, meaning, okay, we analyze this data and we just say, here are the variables, trust us. But we take it a step further at NetraMark. So we're very transparent. So what we actually do is when we deliver the results to the pharmaceutical company, we also have transparency right through to the raw data with the raw patient IDs. So then when we find the variables, we connect it to the patient IDs and we give that to the pharmaceutical companies. And in fact, then their own statistical and bioinformatics people can take those variables that we have then specifically highlighted to them, run their own statistics on it, which would show that they have the corresponding what we call p-values and effect sizes, so that they can validate it on their own end. So it's very transparent from that perspective. It's akin to, remember what I said, what they do now is often the chief medical officer or very, smart individual from a medical practice perspective that understands their drug would, post hoc would say, well, we should look at this variable and this variable. And then the statisticians go and they run their, their analytics and they say, no, that doesn't seem to pan out. What we do is once we expose the variables and the information, the resulting response that we get from the pharmaceutical company is, oh, that makes sense. But because it's transparent, they can do their own validation right through to the patient IDs.
That's amazing. Now, one more quick question for you, George. What can investors expect in the coming quarters?
So in the coming quarters, I think what you're going to start to now see is the contract backlog build. So there's kind of a couple legs that are very important to NetraMark as a company. Number one, contract backlog build. And number two is continued validation, which is actually attached to the question which you just asked me. So in order to validate the technology within this industry, you need to do research and partner with the right people. And if you look, we actually announced a partnership with the NIMH, which is one of the 27 institutes of the NIH. The NIH is the largest biological research organization in the world. We have a strategic collaboration and we'll be co-publishing with the NIMH, where we're analyzing an assortment of their ketamine studies. So we're doing that. And then I think there'll be some further collaborations on the research side that we'll be announcing as well. So we have more collaborations that are very research publication oriented to validate the technology and how it works, which answers one of those questions. And then commercialization and contract backlog build. Those are the two focuses for NetraMark over the next 12 months.
Well, I mean, for investors looking at, the intersection of AI and biotech, NetraMark Holdings is a one to watch. So the company trades on the CSE under the ticker symbol AIAI and on the OTCQB as AINMF. And George, thank you so much. You're also in the Frankfurt at PF0. So definitely head over to their website, take a deeper dive of them, NetraMark.com. George, thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Lindsay. Always appreciate it.
Okay, have a great day.
Bye-bye.